In a literary work, there are many clues to theme, starting with the title. The title might refer to a significant idea in the story. A good title might have a couple of meanings. You need to figure out what it refers to. But the title's often a clue, as in the short story we read, Fear. The main theme is a theme about fear. The characters, of course, relate to the theme, their actions, their motivations, their traits, how they change, and especially what they learn. The strategy we've been working with most is what does the character learn in the story? Plot and conflict are part of theme. Sometimes you need to look at the way the conflict resolves, if it's a negative or a positive outcome for the character, and that result gives you a clue to the theme. The setting is also important. Sometimes the setting is used as a symbol. You might ask, what does this setting represent? Why is this scene set in this place and another scene set in another place? What are the qualities of that setting and how does that relate to the overall message in the story? Oftentimes the language of the story is important. So important statements by people, things like words of the wiser or figurative language or imagery that's used. Lots of times repetition is important. In the story Fear, Joe said, I'd rather be dead than this afraid 3 times. You should sit up and take notice of that when you see it. And then finally, symbols. Lots of times symbols communicate a central idea or theme of the story. When you're writing a theme analysis, though, it's often helpful to have a particular lens that you're looking at the details through. The one we focused on so far is character learning through conflict resolution, and you're asking what does the character learn by having this conflict and then by the way it resolves. This is an example for the story Games at Twilight of how you would use character change or character learning through conflict resolution. It's important to note that when we're looking across the text from the beginning, the middle, and the end of the text, but because we're focused on the conflict, the beginning really focuses around the inciting action where the conflict takes off. The middle is really something that's close to the climax, and the end is the actual resolution where the character has the realization of what they've learned. If you want to pause and read this, you'll get an idea of how this works. Here's another example of the story Fear that we read. And so you'll see that this is really just one of the most basic ways that should work in almost every story for finding the theme. When we're analyzing the development of a theme across a text, we can go across any of the elements of fiction. So for example, you can compare the attitudes or beliefs or actions of different characters across the story. Very often there'll be 3 different characters who influence the protagonist or main character, and the sort of triangulation of those beliefs results in the theme. You're going to want to look at what happens to these people. Is the outcome favorable or not for them? How did it go? So for example, in Blood on the River, we see a developing theme about social class. And we have Master Wingfield, one of the gentlemen. He thinks he's better than Captain Smith and better than the commoners. He says that frequently. And yet in the end, he is booted off the island for essentially stealing from the community's supplies for himself. So he comes to a very bad end in New World. Reverend Hunt is sort of in the middle. He's constantly trying to make peace. He tells Samuel and Richard that they must show extra respect to the gentleman, but in fact, he doesn't really think that they're any better. He says that towards the end that Samuel will not always be a servant. He believes that, personal worth can rise above social class. And so he's a little bit of a middling person for Sam. And then Captain Smith is a commoner and is very resentful of the gentleman. He's constantly needling them, telling them they're no better, telling him they're unfit for the task. And we read the little story that he told when the thresher shark and the swordfish attacked the whale, and he had the very blatant words of the wiser. You see how it is when you've left the confines of England? You might have been born the biggest fish in the sea, but the skill and perseverance of those lower born can take you down and destroy you. So he's definitely power of the people kind of guy, and that is the dominant. That is what happens to Sam. He's not a servant at the end, and he does sort of rise and have its own life in this new world. There are a lot of stories where you might analyze the theme across different settings, across different specific settings in the story. For example, the story Through the Tunnel has 3 settings: the beach, the bay, and the tunnel. The beach represents the boy's childhood. It's familiar, his mother's there, it's safe. When we look at all the language that's used to describe the beach, it's the crowded beach he knew so well, the safe beach, the big beach, his mother's beach. And so that sort of represents and symbolizes the innocence and protection of childhood. Then the boy, on the very first day of his vacation, looks to the wild bay. He desires to go there. When he gets there, he discovers some older teenage boys who are jumping off the rocks, and he desires to prove himself. And then they disappear underwater, and he trains and trains and trains to figure out what he can do to be like them. When you look at the language that's used to describe the bay, it's wild and rocky and steep and rough. It sounds sort of adventurous. And finally, he realizes they're going through an underwater tunnel. And this is literally a passage, a tunnel, through which he must go if he wants to become sort of initiated into the ways of the older boys, which the text actually says, older boys dash the men to Jerry. And he really can't test out anything about this until he actually does it. So he trains and trains and trains to hold his breath, and then he has to go through, and it's very scary and very dark, and there's words to describe it, like there's a barrier to entry, and it's described as having fanged and angry boulders, almost as if it's out to attack Jerry. So through this, we see him moving a theme of growing up, moving from the familiarity of childhood, the sort of adolescence where he's trying things out. When he's in the bay, he actually swims out and sort of looks back at the beach a couple times, kind of getting some reassurance that his mother's still there. But then he has to go through the tunnel completely on his own, and it's a metaphor for his passage into some sort of adulthood or something he does on its own. Games at Twilight works the same way. If you want to pause and read this over, I think you'll see how the 4 different settings represent different stages in Ravi's development of his loss of innocence. And finally, there's the Scepter strategy. The Scepter strategy focuses on the author's style and looks at literary devices. Are there symbols? What's the imagery? Look at the figurative language. Look at the title and the tone, and then look for instances of repetition. When you start to realize that, for example, in the shed, the imagery is all sort of like a mortuary and funereal, and the figurative language points to something gloomy and dark, that you get sort of an overall tone, and you start to pick up on some elements that might relate to a theme the author's trying to convey. The idea here is that even though all the details in the story, all the elements of fiction and the elements of style, like symbols and imagery, should be pointing to the theme, when you sit down to write your analysis, you don't necessarily want just a whole hodgepodge of different things, that you might pick one particular lens and follow that line of thinking as you see the theme developing through that element of fiction or element of style through the story.